Dory 1, this is Fire Team Delta. Dad's coming home. Welcome to the Military Veteran Dad Podcast, where it is our mission to bring every dad home. I am your host, Ben Killoy. I'm a United States Marine veteran, husband, and a father. We will bring authentic conversations to inspire action in your life so we can close the gap between the dad you are today and the dad you want to be tomorrow. This is the Military Veteran Dad Podcast. Welcome back to the Military Veteran Dad, episode 52. We are now on the other side of this mountain going downhill, and today we come back with a interview episode. So I'm putting a hold on the solos for a little bit. They will be back, so don't worry if you enjoyed them as much as I was. They will be coming back, but we're diving into some interviews next. I'd like to remind all the dads out there that if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time in the holiday season, if you haven't joined our Facebook group, this could be the best gift that you give yourself to prepare yourself for the next decade and also the next year. That friendships is one of those things that if you've been listening to the podcast, I talk about it over and over and over. It's the one thing that men want and need, but they aren't willing to admit that they really want or need. And in that Facebook group, we've got a lot of good men who are supporting each other to do life together. And so if you've been listening for a while, I encourage you to give yourself that gift of coming to join the Facebook group, be a part of the community, give yourself the community that you need to help come home in 2020. Today's episode is with Brian Dougherty. He was in the Navy. He's got a 5-year-old and a 16-month-old. He's got a wife of steel, as you'll hear about in the episode, of the things that she had to do and help support the family while he was at home. He's just a great guy. He was actually a listener of the podcast and reached out and wondering if he could be a guest in the podcast to give his view on fatherhood. And we had just a great conversation between two friends. And it was very much unlike an interview, but it was more just about two guys just talking about life and the various things within military, coming home, dealing with our egos, dealing with what it wasn't that we wanted to acknowledge. All of these things we talk about, and it's very good, just wide range of topics covered in this. So if you like just listening to a conversation between two guys having a good conversation about being a dad, this will be your episode. And so without further ado, let's get started with Brian. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it.
Our friendship is just getting started, and you heard me, Michael talking on the podcast and heard that episode and decided to reach out. Go ahead and describe a little bit about your background and what makes you a great dad.
Okay, so my background, I've got two boys, one who is 5 years old and one is about 16, 17 months. I separated from the Navy roughly about a year and a half ago. I'm currently in the reserve, so I'm 1 foot in, 1 foot out, so to speak. I did 8 years active duty, year and a half reserve status. And what makes me a great father, other than loving my kids unconditionally, I don't really know, to be honest with you. I think you'd have to ask them that.
Have you ever asked them that?
I think if you ask my older son, Declan, he would probably say that I always hook him up, meaning, I'm the parent that would sneak him some candy before dinner or before we go to bed, things you shouldn't do. But I do it anyway. I am the rule breaker.
Were you the rule breaker in the Navy?
No, I wasn't.
You were the rule follower.
I was not. I was a rule follower, absolutely. When my time in the Navy, I just wanted to do a good job and make a good name for myself. And it's kind of playing both sides, right? You are in the Corps, you understand. It's playing to the officer side and it's playing to the enlisted side. And so at the end of the day, I always defaulted in trying to follow the rules, do the right thing, because if you didn't, as you know, you got in trouble. It could severely affect your platoon's deployment, your deployment, and the ripple effect could be catastrophic, actually.
So you had a family while you were active, or you've only had your family since you were in the reserves?
I had my oldest son was born when I was active duty, and that was kind of an interesting thing for me because he was born. The Navy said, we'll give you 2 weeks. So I had my 2 weeks with my son and my wife when he was born. Then I had to take off for training. and I had 6 months of training. I came back here and there from training, and not a lot, but like I said, it was here and there. And then when I got done with my training, I had to go to school for 3 months, and then from there they sent me overseas for a 6-month deployment. So it was a really good amount of time until I got to spend some quality time with my son. I want to say it was probably 15, 16 months before I really got to spend time with my son. The only thing that I had going for me was I just knew I had a son. I didn't get a significant amount of time to bond with him before I left for my obligations with the Navy. So there wasn't this, I didn't know what I didn't know, right? I didn't have this overwhelming feeling of like my son, I'm missing him. I just knew I had a son. I didn't get a chance to bond with him just yet. That's all I really knew. So I was kind of lucky in that aspect. As callous as that may sound, I was kind of lucky in that aspect, I feel.
Mm-hmm. Let's rewind to that time frame. What do you think was going through your head when you first came back, when you welcomed, because essentially you saw your son born and then you fast forwarded 6 months, almost like I can't think of the Adam Sandler movie where he has the remote control to fast forward through time, whatever that movie is, where you
Right.
fast forward to 6 months and you get to walk in the door and miss that first 6 months. Did you ever feel like there was emotions there that you weren't dealing with ever? Or like when you came back home, what did that feel like for you?
I was super excited to come home. I spoke to my son to the extent that I could. I saw him on Facebook, or not Facebook, FaceTime. So I was able to somewhat I was able to somewhat build a rapport with him on my end during my deployment when the time I was gone. When I came back, I was super excited. And it's kind of interesting. My buddies would always joke with me. They would say, Brian, when you come home, your son's going to be talking. He's going to look at your wife and say, hey, Mom, who's this guy? And I knew it wasn't going to be like that, but I was kind of worried that it was, because he was all about my wife. They'd had an opportunity to bond. And I still was kind of this individual who he didn't really know all too well. Luckily, since I'm the dad that always hooked him up, I was able to kind of turn that around really quick and kind of buy his affection and love. And, he wasn't completely oblivious to who I was. I just didn't have the opportunity to bond the way I wanted to. I don't know that I really thought about it. I was just so excited to get home and kind of hold him and hug him and just spend some really good time with him. And I knew that it was only a matter of time before we were able to develop that rapport and that bond that I wanted.
What was coming home
Yeah,
like during that time frame after your wife had been alone with a newborn by herself?
I'm sorry?
What was coming home to your marriage like, being gone for that long time?
It was difficult because I essentially, I left. She was going to school at that time. She had just quit her job to start a business, and she was raising my son all by herself. I basically left her. I had no choice. I think it took a bit of a toll on our marriage, as all deployments do, and it takes a moment to get back into the swing of things. She's an amazing woman. For someone to do all that and to keep a smile on your face while I was gone. Looking back, and now that you asked me this question, I'm impressed that she was able to do it. I'm proud of my son, who he is and what he's become thus far, and it has a lot to do with what she was able to give to him while I was gone, and even give to him now.
Mm-hmm.
It took some time. Were you married when you were deployed?
No, I was pretty much put my life on hold when I was in the military. So nothing, I didn't even really date when I was serving. I put it all on hold and didn't start dating till I got out.
Okay. That's probably the smart thing.
But I observed a lot of families in Okinawa be separated, because in Okinawa, you're deploying quite often to countries for a month at a time. So I observed that emotion and that detachment, and I just kind of knew from afar that I didn't want to create a family within that environment.
Yeah, it's tough. My wife, at the time when I joined the military, she was my girlfriend. So she stuck with me all through my active duty and coming home from those deployments. My first deployment, it was fine. It was, I joke with her that her and her girlfriend, she was going to have a 6-month spring break while me and my buddies were deployed. And by and large, they did. And I'm happy that they had that spring break, fun, if you will. But the second one coming back, I think it was a lot more challenging because of all the stress and a lot of the burden that she carried by herself. I'm very thankful for it. I'm impressed.
I'm going to put you on the spot with a question. Take a
Sure.
second to think about it because you might not have an answer right away. If you could go back in time and you only had one sticky note, what piece of advice would you write for yourself to leave on the table on that sticky note? What do you think that Brian 5 years ago needed to hear that you maybe didn't figure out till later?
I don't think I really. So I joined the military when I was 29 years old. I call it my quarter life crisis. And despite being an adult, I don't think I really grew up. I don't think I really got what life was about until I was able to experience the past 8 years. It was from the military basically helped me understand and figure out what it was all about. If I had to leave a sticky note, I would say do it sooner. Trust your gut instinct and do it sooner. I don't have any regrets in life, and I truly believe I am where I am today because of the choices I've made. And it's interesting looking back in life. I chose to go left, and I could have just easily gone right. And analyzing those situations, I would have, if I went right instead of left, I'd be in a completely different situation. I'm okay with all that, right? I'm okay with that. But it took me a while to kind of get out of my way and just go for it and take that leap. So the sticky note, again, would probably say do it sooner.
And that's to do it sooner by joining the Navy?
Joining the Navy sooner, not being afraid, just do it. Just go do it. You have nothing to lose.
What about if I give you a second sticky note to leave it on the table the day you come home and meet your son after 6 months?
What would the sticky note say to myself?
Yeah, but it's your day that you come home. You've been gone for 6 months. What is the Brian that you wish you know now that he needed to know back then?
Tell my wife thank you, and tell her that I love her. I probably should have done that a lot sooner than I did, especially after the fact she raised my son. She was going to school full time. She quit her job to start her own business. Like, that's a lot of stress. The sticky note would tell her I love her, to thank her, to acknowledge her feelings a lot sooner than I did.
And I think what you just acknowledged there, Brian, for every dad out there, if I could talk to the dad listening, this is something that's been repeated multiple times on the podcast, that when you go on a deployment, you're borrowing time from your family, and it's a credit card, and you have to intentionally repay that debt back. And the moment you walk through the door, it starts collecting interest on what you haven't repaid. And we're prioritizing your wife, because throughout everything that you're creating in life, your wife is the one that's going to last forever. Your kids, you could be excited for your 6-month-old, but at some point, your 5-year-old will leave you now. It's going to be guaranteed he's going to leave you out in the world. And that repayment plan to your wife is the one that's going to make it take you to the end of your life. And prioritizing your wife through that has been some of the biggest deployment advice that I've heard over times. And the other one that I often hear is related to try to explore what life was like through those 6 months. Through just, I was just exploring this with the Navy SEAL on last week's episode, and we kind of coined it together, calling it an empathy bridge. Like, truly try to ask questions and dig deep to what life was like while you were gone, because then you can start to build the emotional connection of what she went through. And then you have this bridge of empathy to come back and reestablish that intimacy and connection in your marriage and go forward together, versus trying to play catch up or try to work past resentment. Maybe that by being curious about what life was like, you can kind of catch back up, and then you can kind of go forward together.
Right.
But it takes prioritizing.
Yeah,
You got to show up intentionally, and you got to, like, it starts with even just thanking her and trying, even, especially if your kids were older during this deployment, the same advice, like, what did your kids go through at school? What bullies did they have to deal with that they couldn't talk to you about because you were deployed? All of those things were real moments that you missed, and they may never come to you and tell you them until maybe they're 19, 20, maybe 30, and they'll come back and tell you, like, yeah, while you were gone, I was going through a really hard time. And you're like, well, why didn't you come tell me?
If you're lucky,
If you're lucky. So try to explore the coming home with that curiosity, because I set up Google searches for military dads, and almost every military dad weekly videos is all about the coming home videos where they're at school and they hug, and it's this pure energy of happiness. But that honeymoon phase ends, and you've got to do the real work to rebuild that gap for that time that you borrowed from everyone in the family. And it's an intentional thing. And I believe it's these cyclical withdrawals that lead to such a high divorce rate in the military, because the accounts just keep going bankrupt. It's just like a credit card. There's only so much you can borrow before the bank calls your notes on it and sends you to collections.
Well, it's interesting because I'm sure you're familiar with this. If you're not, you will be. The military is like in your business, right? They're like in your family's business. Not only your business, but they're in your family's business. And they're aware of this high divorce rate. And they know the toll that it takes on your family, your listeners, who are in the military and have families. They know all this. They have FRG clubs, family readiness groups. They have, when you're deployed, they do all they can to, like, bring your wife, your kids into like the military family, to make things okay to the best that they can while you're deployed. And it took me the longest time to understand why they were doing that. I'm like, God, they're so intrusive. Just leave me alone. Leave my family. Well, let us be. Let me do what I want, and let us be. But it's kind of like they knew, right? Like, they understood. And no matter how much they tell you this, it's tough, because you kind of have to figure it out on your own. And then hopefully when you figure it out, it's not too late.
The idea you're dancing around is ego. That that feeling that you're having, like, man, they're up in my business. That's really because if they get up in your business, they'll figure out that you're a fraud. And that is something that a lot of military members hide from, because they don't want you to feel or notice that you don't have it together. And you want that separation, because then it allows your ego to kind of grow itself within your unit at work, but then come home and have your different side of you come out. But that ego is the one thing that'll always get in the way from you coming home as a dad. And it's one of the first things you got to turn off, because you got to be able to recognize what you need to do in order to come home. You can't do it with your ego.
Well, not only that, I mean, the ego destroys everything, right? Like, every relationship you have,
you become that
your
guy.
Ego destroys it. Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, like, coming from, active duty, I was also in the SEAL teams, and, you can get a pretty big ego in that environment. And then to come into the civilian world and to, like, check that ego with all your relationships, whether it's your personal work or just casual acquaintances, it's tough. And I think I would ask you this: was it tough for you to check your ego from coming out of the military? I mean, you were in a highly functioning unit also.
Yeah, I would say my ego was maybe an emotional ego. So for me, deep down inside, I was a scared little farm boy that was scared to really be himself. So my ego was trying to hide that person. And I would always create personas to fit into the groups that I thought I needed to fit into, or thought the groups that I needed to be into to be friends with. And each time I did that, I lost a little bit more of myself. And so for my ego was always keeping that shy Ben Killoy that's never been in a fight, that's never really been in a true conflict with another person where a punch has been thrown. Like, that shy little boy was always in the shadows. And the light was this person that had this facade of being smart, intelligent, and just try to be the guy that could be liked, because that was often the sub programming for me was always trying to be liked around me and just doing whatever it took. Like I look back on some of the things I did, and I was really just waiting for someone to come up to me one day and say, Ben Killoy, I'm proud of you. And it never would come. So my brain just kind of kept doing these things. My ego was trying to hide the fact that I was that scared little farm boy that didn't know what to do.
So when were you able to shed your ego?
Really, when I the first part I would say is when I faced being a veteran on the outside. So I probably ignored being a veteran for 10 years. I didn't really want anything to do with it. I didn't do anything related to it. I didn't talk about it. I was more kind of just keeping it in my shadows. And then as I started my side hustle, I realized that I could serve veterans as one of my first ideas. And that really made me face being a veteran. And then once I started doing that, that's when I got in some dad groups, and I really just kind of got into a safe place of vulnerability and feeling accepted with who I was.
Mm-hmm.
And that safe place really kind of let me kind of almost blossom a little bit and figure out who I am in a very safe manner where you can talk to anybody and just kind of like, and almost when you can let that guard down, the best part of it is you instantly start attracting other people with that vulnerability. Like that's the secret magic to vulnerability. Yeah. People think that it's this weakness that people are going to tear you down. If anything, it makes you stronger and it makes you more attractive, and more people will come towards you because they resonated with what you just shared, because they were saying the same thing. So a lot of me started happening maybe 4 years ago when I started getting in the Facebook dad groups for development, and I started doing some masterminds and really just kind of started peeling back the onion on being self-aware and understanding what all these emotions were. I mean, I don't know if I told you this, but I've told a couple times in the podcast, but through this development, I went to a dad conference, and I went into it as this shy boy that was very nervous about meeting the people that I had met online, because essentially my two versions are merging: the me, Ben Killoy, that shows up in person, and the Ben Killoy that showed up on Facebook. And I was super nervous, and I went in there handshaking, kind of trying to just be the confident Ben Killoy, or the fake Ben Killoy. And instantly people started upgrading the hugs. And I kind of anticipated, but I wasn't going to be the first. So then I go forward and keep kind of hugging. By the end of this conference, I became the guy that gave good hugs. But that was the least likely thing. I have never been a hugger. I've always felt uncomfortable hugging. And now it's something that I admit openly, but it wasn't something that I even acknowledged was there, even knew was there. But it kind of just blossomed in a safe place where it could. And that's what I think you need, that safe place on the other side of transition. And even in active duty, like this is the hardest part about serving in the military, having a family, active duty, is there is no real safe place for you to be vulnerable, because when you're on active duty, your emotions are generally needed to be in check. And if you don't keep them in check, they're going to get killed. Or that's how they train you. So that way you prepare and act the same way when you go into battle. But that lockdown is what always gets us, because you need that safe place to really just kind of sit in that moment. Sometimes I describe it as like, if I'm sad, I'll just say like, I just need to sit in it. I just need to sit in it for 15 minutes and really just let myself feel sad to really understand whatever it's trying to tell me sometimes.
Yeah. So you said a couple of things that kind of resonate with me. One is, I don't think that you or one can operate on that lockdown mode 24/7. I think that's too detrimental to the human psyche.
I agree. And I think this is what just builds up. I think this is what also catastrophically makes people fail on transition, is there's a lot of the worst case scenario happens when someone joins the military that doesn't have an identity. Maybe they had a broken family, and they essentially assimilate the uniform as who they are. They become Superman when they put the uniform on, and their entire identity is wrapped up into that uniform. And it's just this giant, it's almost like the Troy castle. It's this massive castle inside, and eventually it ends and it all comes crashing down, and they have nothing left. Like that's the pit that most people fall into when they surround themselves in that. That's like the extreme part of it. And there's been a couple that I've known that ended up killing themselves because their ego is so strong and identity is wrapped up so much in that uniform that when the uniform came off, they really had no idea who they were.
Well, I don't want to disparage anyone who served or anyone who's serving, but I would venture to say that is very, very common what you just described.
Oh yeah, I mean, military takes the broken people. It doesn't take always the good people. It takes the people that don't have a road to follow, and they're like, "Hey, we'll come over here. I'll give you a road to follow, and I'll give you some money for it. And we'll pay for your college. What can go wrong?"
And it's funny though, because if it takes that certain type of person, that is a family for them. They're getting something they didn't necessarily have in the past. They're getting an identity they couldn't find, and it only ends up potentially, not always, destroying them in the long run, right? Which is it's interesting to me.
And for me, I have a similar one. I didn't really have a clear any identity. I was just a lonely farm boy, I would say, before joining the Marine Corps. And for me, the military kind of gave me pride. It issued me pride, I would say, because I never really felt pride on my own. But it gifted and awakened a lot of other things like leadership. But when I got out, leadership became dormant. It wasn't even something on my radar until 10 years later, until I heard a man talking about Zig Ziglar. And that man just kind of ignited. I'm like, I know all of these answers. And they came from the Marine Corps. They were just suppressed for over 10 years. So there are things that the military gives you for tools, but they kind of dress it up in this uniform part, and you never really get the unpack it. And there is people always talk about the transition from active duty to civilian, but the one they really never talk about, that actually it's a two-sided coin. There's a transition. The very first transition is the one when you put on the uniform. And to really take off the uniform, you really got to go back to the beginning when you put it on and figure out what that person was like then, figure out the person who's taking it off, figure out how you've evolved and grew up, and then figure out how you've changed, and then take that with you. Don't take the uniform with you. Take who you've changed to with you, because you got to compare it back to the beginning. But if you just leave and take that uniform off and assume the operating system will carry you on, the operating system's gone the moment the uniform is gone, but there are skills and traits that live on forever. But you don't think like that. So often you just end up on autopilot for years.
You're absolutely right. Let me ask you this question. Are you fond of your time in the service?
Yeah, I would say I never went to Iraq or Afghanistan, so I would say maybe I had one way to look at it. Like, it was a positive. I lived in Okinawa for 3 years on a tropical island. I got to go to South Korea, the Philippines. It gifted me the idea of experiences. It gifted me the idea of seeing other cultures and experience and seeing a different view than the American way. I do look at it as positive, but what I maybe held back, and this is one of the reasons why I avoid being a veteran, in my mind when I left, I looked in the mirror when I left, and I didn't still love the person that looked back. And I somehow arbitrarily said the military was going to fix that when I joined, and then it wasn't there at the end. So I kind of looked at it as a failure. And even going to the gym, kind of almost, I looked at it as a failure in the Marine Corps. And I just was avoiding it because I didn't want to face that failure again. And even running, I avoided running. I hated running. Those are two things now that are part of my life. I've been going to the gym for 4 days a week at 5 a.m. for the last 2 years. And I just started running in June, and I did a 5K in September. But that was a lot of fear and failure that I was avoiding. So I always loved being a Marine. I didn't always like the Corps, but I loved I still love the pride that Eagle Globe and Anchor is issued when you put it on for that first time. Like, that's something that isn't just taking with you when you leave. Like, you honestly feel when you're a Marine that lives on with you forever. Right.
Well, let me ask you this again. I'm a firm believer, I said it before, is, everything, I don't know if I said it before, but maybe I was thinking it, everything happens for a reason. And I don't really have any regrets. I can look back at my life and kind of analyze the decisions I made and where they brought me to where I am today. Do you think that you could arrive to where you're at today, where you're at? It sounds like you're in a really good place.
I would say an absolute hell no. And And I would say for me, I joined because I was going for the Air Force. So I had never really taken the hard road in life. The Air Force was computers. I wanted
you grew up on a farm though, right?
Yeah, I mean, I knew what hard work was, but it wasn't something I chose. It was just there. I never chose on my own free will to take the hard road. If I'd chosen to be a farmer, then I might consider I took the hard road. But
Right.
I was taking the easy way with the Air Force. I wanted computers. I wanted the least amount of work, and that kind of was my default. But then the Marine recruiter bounced in my life, literally, because he came into the church picnic with the bouncy house. And 2 weeks later, after meeting him, I raised my right hand for the Marine Corps instead. And I was been least likely voted to join the Marine Corps. I was fat. I couldn't run a mile. I couldn't do 3 pull-ups. Could barely do 1 pull-up. And that was kind of like my dare to be great moment to keep pushing myself to something better. And I keep doing that. I got out of the Marine Corps because I felt like I was going to leave something on the table. I've left jobs because I needed to find out what else was out there. I've started this podcast because I felt like there was a higher calling for me to fulfill. And everything keeps pushing me to take that harder road. And I wouldn't have never done that if I hadn't taken the 90-degree turn for the Marine Corps.
So you are kind of where you are, I'd say, because of your experience in the Corps.
100%. Because if I didn't do any of that, I would not have any of the wisdom, or I wasn't anywhere close to where I would be now without that kick in the ass, that being overseas in Okinawa, and also just being in an environment where, I mean, the Marine Corps generally has to do everything a little bit harder. And so that's just kind of in your mind forever. And it's created a tighter identity for me to go into.
Right. So what would be your one piece of advice that you would write down on a sticky note had you had just one sticky note?
Ooh, if I had one sticky note, I'd probably be my favorite transition advice. It would be talk to strangers as often as possible. Okay. Because that has really been the second catalyst almost 4 years ago when I started talking to dads at the park. That really was a catalyst that would have gotten me here much faster. And if the Marine Corps took you to a conference and said, take this product and sell it to 100 people, and you have no idea who they are, and you just got to do that exercise of talking to someone random, building a rapport, trying to sell them on something, that skill would have served me 1,000 times better than figuring out how to write a resume. Because every opportunity in your life is created through a conversation. And if you don't feel comfortable through a conversation, you can't create opportunity. So it's all tied together. And a lot of veterans don't feel comfortable talking just because we feel maybe broken, we feel labeled, we feel like they don't understand us. All of these things can be pushed through if you get comfortable talking to strangers.
Yeah. It's a good piece of advice, and I definitely don't disagree with it. At the end of the day, it's all about relationships and connection. And you can't really do that with a resume. It might be able to open the door. You need that
feeling of friendships on the other side. That's what everybody wants back, but no one really knows it. And if you have friends, if you have that feeling of someone's there that you can talk to, you can do anything. But if you don't have that, then you really can't do anything. But it all starts with talking to someone, and you just got to put in the reps, as I call it. And if you keep putting the reps, talking to people, you'll eventually get to that one person that can completely change your life. But you won't be prepared for it because you haven't practiced and put in the reps, and you'll probably just walk on by because you hesitated and didn't say hello.
So I'm not going to ask you why you weren't for as long as time you weren't proud to be a veteran, or you just wouldn't openly acknowledge it. And if you want to talk about it, that's fine. This is your podcast, not mine. But I will say this. The people that have been most willing to talk to me have been veterans. I remember when I was getting out, I had more veterans I've never met before. Veterans reached out to me, saying, hey, man, we love you, because veteran suicide is pretty high. So I think there was a part of that. Hey, man, we love you. I'm here for you. Whatever you need, let me help you, whether it's whatever it is in life, let me help you. And it was my transition of getting out and having the veteran community open up their arms to me to have these conversations. It's the second time that I really fell in love with America. And I was like, I'm really proud to be an American. I'm proud to have served. I'm proud that I'm a veteran. I'm proud of the veteran community. And it was because of what you just said, is getting out there and talking to people. And as I said earlier, it was a veteran community that did that embraced me.
And I would say for me, it was more tied to a little bit of how it ended. I had to participate in a court martial that really kind of just tainted my view of my ending. But
sure.
in general, it was more tied to, if I would have been willing to talk to people, I probably could have created that space, but I wasn't.
Yeah.
And I wasn't willing to admit that I was afraid. And so those two combined essentially created a barrier that I didn't feel connected, and I wasn't doing anything, or didn't realize I had to do something for it to feel connected. I wasn't aware at this time that talking to people was the thing holding me back, but it really was the thing holding me back, because all the people that I know now were there in the beginning. During that time, I just wasn't doing anything about it. I wasn't talking. I wasn't trying to network. I was just trying to be the guy that hopefully didn't get figured out.
You were kind of blind to it. You didn't want to see it. You didn't want to accept it. Yeah.
Yep. So let's switch back to you for a second. I feel like you're interviewing me here for a second, which is fine.
Okay.
So you're in the Navy Reserve now, right? Or do you switch branches?
That's correct.
Okay. So you're in the Navy Reserve now. What does life look
correct.
like on the other side of your services in the reserve? What are you dreaming for your life to be created when you become free of the service?
I think about that a lot. And as a reservist, I'm still getting, the Navy is still messing around with me. I'm still getting pulled in all different directions. They're still saying one thing, doing another. They're still being hypocrites, all that stuff. I have to go report next week to my reserve unit. And I've spent 24 hours trying to book an airline ticket and get orders so that I can go do this. I'm trying to be a super squared away sailor. I'm trying to be good, right? But they make it very difficult for me to be good and for me to get my stuff. I have a full-time job. I have a family, and I have a watch business that I'm trying to get off the ground and get up and running. I don't have time to deal with the stupidity that the reserves brings, because no one can help me out, right? You understand, like, the military is just stupid sometimes, right? Like, the system doesn't work when you need it to work the most. So what does my life look like on the outside when I'm done? It's spending time with my boys and teaching them the lessons that I learned while I was active duty that I thought were valuable to me becoming who I am today. I started a watch company and named it after my son because part of the idea was I wanted him to learn those lessons. And I liked watches. And I thought, and I still do think this, that he can learn these lessons that I learned through someday running this watch company with me and learning those lessons and learning about how I operate and why I operate the way that I do. I don't know that I'll ever be out of the Navy. I was only going to do 6 years, then I did 8 years. Now I'm in the reserves. So it's kind of one of those things. I love to hate it.
Yeah.
And I hate to love it,
It's like a child in your life. Don't go away until it leaves the house.
Until it leaves the house. So I got to go report next week to San Diego. It's just a big ass pain for me just to get all this stuff done. I'm like,
don't you live in Colorado?
And I live in Colorado. That's right. And so,
where there's no boats.
Well, there's no boats. Well, the reserves, I don't know how I don't understand how it's set up, but I will drill out of Buckley Air Force Base with a bunch of Navy people. I don't know why the reserves say you can live wherever you want to live, despite there's no water there. I don't get that. I don't really
Especially
care
the Navy.
to
I feel like that one's an
right?
oxymoron.
Right, but it works, right? Like they do it, like they go drill, and then if they get called up, then and when I say drill, like they're not like practicing stuff that you would do on the ship out here. It's more of accountability type deal. Like, okay, is your medical record squared away? You got to do your PT test, hang out for 2 days, 1 week in a month. You know, it's kind of make sure your dental all. So it's more of accountability type deal. For me, I can go to San Diego and drill with my reserve unit out there and do sustainment training that they deem helpful. So whatever. Anyways, they let me do that. It's cool. I'm happy. I can live in the states I want to live in, and then when I get bored or cold out here, I got to go to San Diego, and so it's like this pendulum back and forth. I'm getting tired. I get tired of the civilian world, and I got to go play Navy SEAL for the weekend. I'm like, oh yeah, now I remember why I left active duty, and then I go back to civilian world, and it's just it's back and forth. But to answer your question in a long-winded way, it's spending more time with my boys and teaching them to be the person that they want to be. And I think that's hard for people to do because of all sorts of reasons, outside influences, trying to fit in, all sorts of stuff like that. And we were kind of talking about this with earlier, that when I stopped really caring about what other people cared about and what I thought I should be and what I thought I should be doing, life got so much better. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, it's got to be a maturity thing, right? Like it's got to be as you get older, like you feel that way. I don't know.
I've definitely seen it as there's like in the 20s you care what everybody thinks. In the 30s you don't really have time because you have kids, and by 40s you really just don't get. And then by 50 you're doing your own program, and everybody else has created their own program, so why not? And you're not worried about Facebook, the other 50-year-old guy next door anymore, because it's not a matter about keeping up because you're halfway through the race. And at that point, I think everybody's in a different mindset of how they're looking towards the end versus looking at the race and figuring out what the next guy's doing.
Well, you can check you're like more able to successfully check your ego. You're like, whatever, right? Like,
yeah.
Okay, man, it's always about that ego, and it always messes things up.
Here's a question I haven't asked in a long time, but my answer might be interesting to share. Fast forward, your 5-year-old is 30 years old. He's at a bar talking with his friends, and he's describing what his dad is like. What's something that you hope to be in that sentence or that paragraph that he describes you as, that you've instilled with him by the age of 30?
I hope he says he describes me as loving and caring. I can't say, I think about this a lot, quite frankly. I don't care. 30 years old in the bar. Wow, that's a very poignant question. What is he going to look like? What's he going to do? He's probably not going to be doing anything that I thought he would be doing or anything that I remotely have an interest in doing, me personally, like something completely on the opposite end. I hope he describes me as a loving father, a loving and caring father, because that's how I describe my parents. And I think that's the best gift, in my opinion, that you can give your children, is let them know that you love and care about them. That's how I describe my relationship with my parents, or my childhood growing up. Is, I can say, despite how many ever fights I got with my parents, despite how many times they grounded me, despite how many times they still annoy me to this day, all I can say is they still love me. And I know that they still love me, and I feel it. So I hope that's what my son can say about me when he's 30 years old at a bar. First of all, I hope he's not at a bar drinking. I hope he learns from my mistakes and doesn't drink at all.
Well, I think every kid has to go through the phase of figuring it out, that part on their own. The question is kind of rooted in the idea, as you go through a parent, that there's lots of things that you start worrying about. But honestly, the only ones that matter are the ones that are going to affect those answers when he's 30, describing you to a friend. And those are the long-term deposits that you're making in their life. And as long as you're making those in the right categories, everything else will work out. Everything else goes away and they'll forgive you. And even on your worst week or day or month, I mean, kids forgive parents like snap of their fingers. Like you're the hero no matter what kind of day you had at work. And that mindset, just remembering, is this really going to matter if he's describing me at a bar when he's 30? And if it's not, then he's just going to brush it off and let it go, because that's an easy way to refocus on what matters as a dad and let go of control, which was something we were talking about before we hit record. And
right.
Focus in on that legacy. We haven't talked about it, but I've pretty much talked about every episode now, that the biggest thing that military dads leave on the table is focusing their efforts on creating a legacy that goes beyond them, that goes beyond their kids. And it's a generational legacy that generally, if you put enough effort in, can really make a momentum and change the world. Because if you start making a generational type legacy and family with values and instincts and experiences, you can really start to make a difference in this world 100 years into the future by taking it.
Oh, absolutely. I don't disagree with you. I've never actually heard anyone say that before. So it's a very profound thought. And I think dads and parents think that way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the majority of them do?
Maybe I don't think so, because most dads, the problem with this legacy is there's so much routine that there's no time to pause. Like it's a downside of capitalism. Consumerism is about patterns. Patterns require you to go to Target every weekend to do your Target run, to spend that same amount of money. That pattern, the groceries, the homework, the sports, that pattern prevents you from really pausing and thinking. But that pattern keeps consumerism running. But at the same time, that pattern prevents you living an extraordinary life, because you really need to break the pattern in order to do something different, to create a child that believes the world can be different. Because if you create a child that just knows how to work the pattern, they're really not going to go out there and do anything magical, because they're just going to re-enter the pattern. And you got to break that pattern to really change that. Have you heard of the Navy SEAL Andy Stumpf?
Yes, I have.
So he was on the podcast, and he gave me a brilliant piece of advice to kind of spearhead this legacy. As a Navy SEAL, he's trained to be an effective killing force, but that effectiveness is limited to how far the bullet can travel downrange. That no matter how much training, no matter how much effort, the bullet still travels the same amount of distance. But as a father, that bullet and your effectiveness as a father can literally go 100 years into the future. So when you think of where your time and energy are best spent, you will always be more effective as a dad years into the future than you will as someone that serves in the military. Not to discredit what we do in the military. I mean, it's purposeful, and it has at the same time, it has a purpose, but it's a finite purpose, and it will end. But the effort that you put in as a dad will literally go 100 years into the future if you do it right.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, it comes back to this thing of human connections and relationships, right? The relationship that you have with your child. It's an interesting thought. And you're right. I don't know that people necessarily think about it, but you brought it to my attention, and absolutely. It totally makes sense. 100%.
I was at a conference in August, and it was a podcast conference. And at the end of it, they were doing a montage. And I don't know how I put this together, but something about the montage, I was just thinking about all the random podcasts that were there. And I was like, because podcasting is about human connection. It's about two people having a conversation and sharing it with thousands at the same time. And I realized that currently the construct of society is that almost the hope of humanity sits in the internet. It sits in Facebook. It sits in Instagram, which is where everybody's focus goes. But the hope of humanity doesn't lie in the internet. It lies in human connection. And I think that's what I like about podcasts, because it's more about the connection. So as we figure out better ways to come back together as a country and a society and occupants of planet Earth, I believe we have the tools and capacity to change the world that we live in faster than ever before. But until we figure out how to create that human connection and focus on generational type change, we'll still always be a little bit stuck, because we'll be outsourcing our hope to the internet, which, if you've ever been on Twitter, there's not much hope there. It's a wrong place to invest your hope.
understand what you're saying. I would like to put a little bit of a spin on that, if I may. See, I feel like there is hope for humanity, despite all that stuff going on, because at the end of the day, we as humans crave human connection and relationships. Now, some of them might be misguided or misinterpreted, or people might think it's a real thing when it's not via social media, Twitter, and all that stuff. But really, at the end of the day, we crave human connection, contact, and relationships, that nothing will ever be able to replace that other than actual human connection.
In my comments more tied to like people, like the connections on the internet are good and they connect with people and you make more friends, like this connection, but people put their hope in the internet. The real hope comes from you sharing a coffee with someone and understanding what their day's like. That's where you're going to move mountains. Then we haven't lost the social media world, that we get more connected to our phone than you through the people sitting next to us.
Well, again, I have hope for humanity, because I understand what you're saying, but I think,
and I have hope too. It's just that people are looking in the wrong areas. That I feel like as podcasting grows, that's where the hope comes from, is through conversations and micro conversations. Podcast. I described it as like a windshield that's cracked. That the United States is a fractured windshield that's not broken. There's still the film holding it all together, but it's 1,000 pieces. And the media can't have enough conversations to put all the pieces back together. But podcasting is essentially, there's 750,000 podcasts in the English language. All of those little conversations, microchasms in every category of every niche you can think of that maybe is a societal problem, they're all happening on some social level now with podcasting. And those are like the glue that are going to go in between those cracks and put it back together. Like, I'm more convinced than ever that the conversations that podcasting is having will be the micro chasms that starts to piece back the conversations and the glue and the windshield back together. And it's happening below the surface of what the media is noticing, which is where really I get the most hope, is that if you look to like the media, you probably lose hope. But if you look to podcasting, what's being created, and if you go to these conferences where podcasters come together, the conference in August, like I've had more hope than ever, because there are good people out there. You just need to create those connections, and I can create 1,000 times better human connections at a conference than I can sitting on Facebook. And I could spend 2 years trying to create a business on Facebook and really never get anywhere. But 3 days at a conference, you could move a mountain and find that one person you need to know your entire life.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It's not interesting. It's just I think we forgot about it. It is, and it is interesting, but like it's basic, right? Like
it's going back to the basic instinct. I've heard it described that in 2010, social media was the next big thing. In 2019, talking to people will be the next big thing. It'll be coming
right, and that's
circle.
what we've been doing. Yeah, and I think that we're just blind right now. Like, society's just blind. It's just this stuff is flat.
It's caught in those patterns.
Even I like will find myself like on Instagram, and I'm just I get sucked in, and I gotta snap out. I'm like, what are you doing? Who cares? Who cares? Go talk to someone.
Yeah.
Get out of you, like go outside, go talk to someone. And I enjoy like people watching, and when people, you go on a street, if you don't do this, just pay attention to people that are walking around who have their heads in their phones, crossing streets, not looking at one another, and really just like in this stupid device of ours. It's ridiculous to me. I started playing this little game with myself, pretending that I didn't have a cell phone. Because pretending I don't have a cell phone, pretend it doesn't exist. Like, don't like worry about it. And when I first started playing this game and doing this exercise, it was really weird at first, because for like the first few days when I did this, I was like, what? I don't get what I'm supposed to do. Because even I found myself when I'm bored or I don't want to talk to someone, I just like pull out my phone and I just do whatever I do on my phone, right? Mm-hmm. But since I started doing this exercise, when I first started doing it, it was really weird. I was like, I don't know what to do. And then eventually, like, you get kicked out of it fairly quickly. And it's like, all right, I'll go talk to someone, or I'll just stare and look at the clouds or enjoy something that actually exists, that I can touch, that I can smell, that I can see. And, it's interesting. I would recommend you try it sometime if you haven't already.
I've had a few occasions where I've had to go multiple a day without anything insequentially, just from breaking things or things not working or forgetting it somewhere.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's a real deal.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we talked about this, and yet I would still say, like, I still fall prey to it, even though I'm aware of it.
Yep.
Anyhow.
Well, Brian, as we wrap up this conversation, it's been a really wide conversation, let's call it, because we've dived into a lot of different areas on this conversation. It's very much almost like, more than maybe most episodes, I feel like we just sat down at a coffee shop and had a conversation about life in a lot of random different areas. That's some of the best stuff, because that's where the gold comes from. What's one parting piece of advice that you want to leave for every military dad listening to this? If you could sum up from what you've learned.
Oh, man. One piece of advice. I it's kind of like what we had talked about earlier. Don't forget who you are, and don't forget to. I would say don't forget to who you are, who you really are inside, because I think once I know for myself, once you. It hasn't been recently until I've been very comfortable with who I am and what I've done and what I know and what I don't know. And when I realized that, when I checked my ego, the world opened up to me. And when I can be myself, and I can be happy, and the world opened up to me, then I can be so much better to my children. I can be so much better. I can be a better father. I can be more compassionate. I can be more understanding. And so my advice would be, don't forget who you are. I
love that.
Are.
No one's given that advice at the end, so that's a new one. So I like it, and it is a perfect way to remind a dad that the first step to coming home is to remember you are a person of value. Your kids love you, and that you are their hero. And stepping into who you are is the best way to fulfill your marriage and your life.
Yeah. I think so. I agree.
Well, Brian, I want to personally thank you for, one, reaching out to me blindly on the internet and asking me to come on the podcast, because I know this conversation is going to bring a few dads home, and I appreciate your time tonight. I know it was a little bit, we were wondering if it was going to happen, but I'm glad we made it happen, and I look forward to getting this episode out into the world.
Absolutely. And I want to say thank you for having me on the show. This was a conversation I did not expect to have tonight. It was profound, poignant at times, and thank you very much. You've caused me to think a little bit further beyond than I normally do on certain topics, and consider some things I didn't consider. So I appreciate that, Ben. And from one veteran to another, thank you very much for what you do. Like I said earlier, I'm proud to be a veteran. I fell in love with America because of people exactly like you that are willing to talk, that have opened up their arms. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate that too. And as we're just around the corner from Veterans Day, happy Veterans Day.
Likewise, brother.
All right. Well, thank you, and you have a great night.
All right, you too, bud. Thank you.
That's a wrap. And thank you for listening to today's show, and I really hope you enjoyed it. The lifeblood of any new podcast are the reviews. If you haven't reviewed the podcast yet on iTunes, I would really appreciate it, and you will help us get the message out to even more military veteran dads. As John Maxwell says, if there is hope in the future, there is power in the present. Dads, it's time to come home.